Joining me now is Deputy Director at Atlantic Council's Eurasia Centre, Melinda Haring. Melinda, good afternoon to you. Thank you for talking to us. So what does it mean for diplomacy?
I don't think it means a whole lot for diplomacy. We are not anywhere close to a real diplomatic deal. What it means is that Britain is the leader in the West. So Britain is not only giving some of the largest military assistance. Your foreign minister has also called for the West to give airplanes, and now you're going to be sending an additional 8,000 troops. I think it means that you guys are the moral leader, and you may not have the same kind of troop numbers and equipment that we do in Washington, but you're the indisputable leader. So that's my take.
It's interesting, isn't it, about planes, this issue of planes. The US has effectively said, absolutely no way are we sending planes, haven't they?
They have, and we don't see that changing anytime soon, unfortunately. The White House continues to insist that there's a difference between escalatory weapons and defensive weapons. I think that is changing. I think Bucha has changed that. The massacre that we saw in that suburb outside of Kiev has changed sentiment some. There's also polling that shows that more than 70% of Americans support Ukraine, and there's strong congressional support. So I think eventually the United States may relent on the plane issue, but not so far.
And what about sanctions? It does seem like an ideal situation, doesn't it? If Biden's saying, oh, we're going to sell off these, whatever they've seized from the oligarchs and help rebuild Ukraine.
It seems like a delicious and an idea to me and a no-brainer. So some people have even suggested that perhaps the assets could be used for the Ukrainian army, but also that maybe potentially some of the properties could be given to the Ukrainians for their MFAs, for Ukrainian cultural centers. I think that's a really interesting idea.
We're nowhere near rebuilding, are we, yet? So let's talk about this huge troop deployment. They're going to Eastern Europe for drills. What does it mean for NATO that the Brits are sending 8,000 troops to those exercises?
It means that the British government understands the severity of the situation. I think it also means that the West realizes that this conflict is not going away. It's not, we shouldn't be talking about it in weeks or months. It's going to be a long conflict. And it symbolizes the importance of NATO and that the Brits have the Poles and Eastern Europe's back. I think it's a very strong message.
Because we also have the Danes, Iceland and Norway taking part, and that is quite significant, isn't it?
It is, and we may see NATO membership expand very soon as well. So, you know, in terms of Putin's aims, he wanted to destroy the unity of NATO. He's failed spectacularly at that.
Diplomacy, let's go back to that. It's been an interesting week for that, hasn't it? Because we had Antonio Guterres in Moscow and then in Kiev. Zelensky called for him to go to Kiev first and then go to Moscow. What did you make of his trip? Let's start with his meeting with Lavrov.
So I think it was a big screw up to go to Moscow first rather than Kiev. I think Zelensky was right to criticize him. Why would you go visit the aggressor first? He should have gone to the victim first. I thought his language in particular was weak. He said, I see evil. Why didn't he identify where the evil was coming from? It was also striking that the Russians attacked Kiev during his visit. They were basically giving the head of the UN the bird. They were saying that we don't respect the UN. And you know, nothing came out of the visit. It's good that he tried. He got assurances from the Russians that they would be able to open up a humanitarian corridor in Mariupol, but so far no dice.
Do you think that his language was weak? I mean, he was operating within the confines that he has to, okay, right? Because obviously Russia are on the Security Council, they have that veto power, permanent member. But he stood next to Lavrov and said, this isn't a situation where the Ukraine has its troops in Russia. Russia has its troops in Ukraine.
I mean, that's like saying snow is white. I'm not very impressed. I think that his language could have been stronger. It doesn't matter that Russia's part of the Security Council. His job is to be the conscience of the world, and he should have identified Putin as the source of evil. It's not enough to just go to Kiev and say the war is evil. That's an obvious thing to say.
Do you think anything came of that trip?
No, so far there's nothing tangible that came out of it. Okay. I think actually it was harmful in that it showed the toothlessness of the UN and that he went and groveled to Putin before he went and expressed sympathies in Ukraine.
Okay, so where now for diplomacy? Where now for negotiations to end this? All war ends in some sort of a negotiation, doesn't it?
It absolutely does, but it's too soon to talk about negotiations. Yes, Moscow and Kiev should try to talk and try to work towards some kind of solution. But the bottom line is this. The Russians are not willing to really negotiate. Putin is angry. He bet his 22-year legacy on destroying Ukraine. There's some really tricky issues. So the status of Crimea is going to be very tricky. Neither side is willing to give at all on that issue. The status of the Donbass is going to be very tricky. Neither side is willing to give. The Ukrainians have been willing to give, or at least consider giving, on the issue of NATO membership. Now, more than 70% of Ukrainians want to join NATO, but President Zelensky has said we can put our aspirations on ice. We are willing to consider NATO neutrality in exchange for security guarantees from Western countries. But there wasn't enough room on that. And also, there were more hostilities. There were more atrocities that came out. Bucha happened, and then Mariupol happened, and then there were more strikes on civilians. So that also put the negotiations, it froze the negotiations, and for good reason. Well, why should Zelensky negotiate with the Russians when they're raping civilians? And after all the horrific images in Bucha, I think it's time for Moscow to give if they want to end this war. They clearly don't, though.
What do you make of the fact that, yes, they've sent these troops to Eastern Europe for the military drills, but at the end of the day, all they're offering, the West, all they're offering Zelensky, Ukraine, is words, some weaponry, and a lot of money. Do you think money is where it's at?
No, I don't think money is where it's at. But look, all the Western governments have said we will not fight in Ukraine, that we will enable the Ukrainians to continue to fight. If you want peace, and this is going to sound a little Orwellian, if you want peace, you have to wage war now. So the West needs to continue to send as many weapons as possible, give the Ukrainians economic support, and enable them to continue to fight so that they can get a real deal at the negotiating table.